We all like to play games, but what does that mean? Let's start with some history. Board games, just after World War II. It was, after all, World War II that gave rise to some of the greatest technological leaps in the 20th century. After World War II, military strategy games such as Risk and Diplomacy gained widespread popularity. These games allowed players to simulate complex, real-world activities at home, for fun, without all the messiness of real war. World War II also gave people the computer technology required to produce the earliest video games, and it was in 1958 that William Higginbotham created Tennis for Two. A not quite so complex interaction, but fun nevertheless. Tennis for Two was as simple as it gets, and not technically a video game. It ran on analog equipment. Players simply had to project the angle of the ball and then hit a button at the right time. As simple as Tennis for Two is, it did introduce some ideas that certainly stuck. Primarily, the idea of an abstract controller interface to mediate user engagement. The twist of a knob and the press of a button, and the ball went flying. In 1962, a little missile was launched into space on the screen of a PDP-1 computer in an MIT laboratory. Space War was a runaway success and is typically cited as the birth of the modern video game. In 1966, Ralph Baer, a television engineer, began working on bringing these types of games into the homes of consumers. But it wasn't until the 1970s when Baer's idea would catch on in any serious way. In 1972, the Magnavox Odyssey shipped 200,000 units in America, but Atari was by far the most important video game producer at the time. By 1979, Atari's gross income hit the $200 million mark, indicating that video games were a major economic force not to be taken lightly. Atari became the first real industry giant. Its games were well made, and to quote Nolan Bushnell, "We knew our technology, everyone else just Xeroxed our technology." Since the Atari, video games have been a regular fixture in the homes of millions, and Atari's success is important for video games as an economic force, but also for furthering the medium in terms of how it engaged players and how games developed stories. In the 1970s, much of the groundwork for what we now study in games, or game studies, or game theory, was laid. While the earliest games were action games where user input was reactive and based on timing, the 70s saw the birth of adventure games as well. Adventure games ran on computers and required a keyboard for the input of commands. Fantasy and role-playing games, popularized by tabletop counterpart games like Dungeons & Dragons, which came earlier, found a new home on computers. Two other game genres took shape during this period as well. Both of them stem from tabletop role-playing games. Strategy games and MUDs, or multi-user dungeons, which is basically a build of an adventure game that allowed multiple users. The 1980s saw a number of technological developments that allowed games to engage players with better graphical capabilities, more immersive stories, and identifiable avatars, so not just these little block things. In short, games became less visually abstract.
Around this spot, sadly. But there's a few wrecks yonder that...
True story. So, cops arrive, and Maurice's little band of brothers arrive, and pow, 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 pow.
In the process of becoming less visually abstract, games also became less the product of a player's imagination, and even more of an easily digestible consumer product. Games began to grow in genre, scope, graphical capability, and economic significance. These developments continued, multiplied, and grew exponentially over the next 30 years. And it is for these reasons, based on these developments, that arguments can be made about games. Arguments like, are games art? Are games cultural artifacts? Are games worth studying? Are games supplanting film? The answer to all of these questions is yes, unequivocally so. So how do we best study games? They seem to enter into a number of genres, a number of interactive modalities, all at the same time. So maybe the best way to study games is to first focus on what makes them unique as a medium. In the introduction to the first widely accepted textbook on game studies, appropriately titled Understanding Video Games, Mark Wolf and Bernard Perron write about some distinct elements that are at the heart of what makes the video game a unique medium. These elements are algorithm, player activity, interface, and graphics. Graphics and interface are often simply defined. The visual components on the screen comprise the graphics, and the interface is the junction point between input and output, hardware and software, the player and the material game itself. It is through the interface that player activity occurs, and here is where the great debate of game studies begins. Player activity is perhaps the most important part of the video game experience. Without it, there's no meaning, there's no game. Player activity is necessarily ergodic, a term from Epson Arth's work, Cybertext, which means, it's a term appropriate from physics that derives from the Greek words ergon and hodos, meaning work and path. In ergodic literature, non-trivial effort is required to allow the reader to traverse the text. If ergodic literature makes any sense as a concept, there must also be non-ergodic literature as well, where the effort to traverse the text is trivial, with no extra nomadic responsibilities placed on the reader except, for example, the eye movement and the periodic and arbitrary turning of pages. It's a complex way to describe reading a book. Text as diverse as multi-user dungeons and adventure games, the I Ching or a novel like House of Leaves, all serve as examples of ergodic literatures. However, it is in this intersection between the diegetic world of the player's avatar on screen and the player's physical actions in the real world that a disruption in potential meaning occurs. The last element of games pointed to by Wolf and Perron is algorithm, or the programming itself, the computer code which controls the game's graphics and sound, the input and the output engaging players, and the behavior of non-player characters, or NPCs, in games. Taking the interaction defined by Epson Arth as ergodic, we'll discuss the techniques, the types of interactivity between players and algorithms, between gamers and systems, in order to better understand the ways in which players make meaning from game texts. Because games are already conceived of as interactive, deconstructing the term is necessary to proceed. After all, what makes playing games, which are interactive, different from playing with a puppy, which is also interactive? Typically, games are considered interactive based on player activity. That is, the way in which the player inputs physical action to a controller device to convey action on the screen, which then gets portrayed graphically by the player avatar. That's a lot of mediation. This understanding of interactivity of games is fundamentally limiting. In reality, the player is not truly interacting with the game, just simply engaging in pre-coded procedural systems that control the behavior of the player character in the game world. In fact, the player is interacting on a number of extra-diegetic levels because of the ergodic nature of game texts. Players often create other forms of input that aren't mediated by the algorithmic procedures of game text because they are responding to the game text emotionally, socially, and culturally. This kind of extra-diegetic identification and meaning-making is key to not only understanding games, but also to understanding how we study games as objects, as texts themselves. The tension between algorithm and player activity illustrates the tension at the heart of the debate in game studies that stresses the tensions between two opposing ways of understanding games themselves: ludology and narratology. Ludologists understand games as a system of actions and events. They tend to eschew narrative elements as key to understanding games as objects of study in favor of focusing on structure and gameplay elements. Narratologists focus on the narrative aspects of games as key to understanding. Despite the appearance of fierce debate over the best way to study games, there is significant overlap between the two modes of understanding, and in arguing that the debate itself is not really a debate at all. Gonzalo Frasca appeals to Arthet, saying, "To claim that there is no difference between games and narratives is to ignore essential qualities of both categories. And yet, the difference is not clear-cut, and there is significant overlap between the two." Jesper Juhl acknowledges the same overlapping of games and narratives in his work, Games Telling Stories. He says, "I would like to repeat that I believe that 1. The player can tell stories of a game session. 2. Many computer games contain narrative elements, and in many cases, the player may play to see a cutscene or realize a narrative sequence. 3. Games and narratives share some structural traits. Indeed, the ludology-narratology debate is missing a key point in understanding what games mean. And that is that the site of meaning maker between player and game occurs within the ludic system of a game and the extra-pneumatic activity of the player. So how do we understand the interactivity of ludic and narrative systems? And how do we use an understanding of these two types of systems to inform a more thorough study of games and meaning making? Well, somewhat paradoxically, the genre of games that limit player interactivity to the highest degree are the ones that have the strongest ludic and narrative systems. That's role-playing games and adventure games.
It's some sort of special work order.
To all agents from Office Manager Don Copel.
All right, you boneheads, thank your lucky stars and get to your friggin' cars. We have a mass poisoning on our hands. Too many dead to assign specific cases, so all clients are first come, first serve. So let's see some hustle out there.
Oh, you want to be a pirate, eh? You look more like a flooring inspector. But if you're serious about pirating, go talk to the pirate leaders. You'll find them in the scum bar.
Gosh, thanks. I'll do that. Bye now. I'm off to seek my fortune.
Good luck.
Where did you say those pirate leaders were?
The scum bar.
Right. Thanks. Re-elect Governor Marley. When there's only one candidate, there's only one choice.
Again, if player interactivity is defined as the player engaging the ergodic nature of game text via extradiegetic input or output, then players often create other forms of input that simply aren't mediated by the algorithmic procedures of game text, because they're responding to the game, as I said earlier, emotionally, socially, and culturally. Since this is the case of player interactivity, the way that players engage adventure games is really strikingly similar to the way that players engage traditional forms of literature. And this isn't entirely wrong to say. The problem is that if a game is like another in literature, then it's to be studied as something that's not quite a game. Edward West, in his article, A Too Coherent World, Game Studies and the Myth of Narrative Media, writes about a fear of colonization by other disciplines in game studies, and notes other writers, such as Espen Arseth, who say that game studies would be reduced to a form of media, film, or literary studies. In the video game aesthetic, play is form. David Myers makes the analogy that it is all too easy to make playing games is to reading books, but he includes a qualifier. Sort of. That sort of is the problem inherent in game studies. While reading a book, viewing a film, or perusing a piece of visual art demand interpretive interaction from viewers, the passivity of experience in these media is always near at hand. After all, one would not compare the process of playing Ultimate Frisbee to the process of watching, Madame Butterfly? But there is a kind of similarity in the two, insofar as one is engaged in taking part of each and actively constructing meaning from the process. Myers goes on to explain that the initial processes of learning to play games are similar to the initial processes of ways to read, and that different control schemes relate to different ways of reading. The simplicity of the control mechanism corresponds to the simplicity of the game text itself. And while this isn't always true, it has been a standard long enough to bear weight. For example, a simple control mechanism tends to include a simple text, and vice versa.
Sun came up and pop! Out of the egg came a tiny and very hungry caterpillar. He started to look for some food.
April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain.
Still, the art of playing itself goes largely unexamined. One does not watch a video game, one does not read a video game, one does not, to borrow Laura Mulvey's term, employ a gaze upon a video game. One plays a video game. Then more often than not, one plays with a video game. As such, play is the starting point for real analysis of games. Play, of course, is far more active than other interactions people have with art, and most social scientists cite three types of human play. Locomotor play, which is play with the body by leaping and running and jumping and soaring or falling. Object play, which is play with items and objects, and social play, which is play with others. Sports combine these types of play with systematized rules and structures, and thus we have games. Video games do just the same. The difference, however, is that video games move these three types of play into a fictional world. The player, him or herself, is in the real world manipulating a controller to achieve all three types of play at once. It is because of this removal of the player from the real world and into the game world that video games are so complex to study. Games contain aesthetic experiences and imitations of reality that constitute art beauty, visual beauty, so that we're in essence combining play with literature. And this is something that is unique to the medium of video games. After all, there's not just player activity, but there is player interactivity. and that encompasses all of the types of human play described, as well as the types of interactions had by the player in the real world while they're playing the game itself. The term for where these interactions take place is called the magic circle. The term magic circle was coined by a Dutch historian, Johan Huizinga. In Homo Ludens, a study of the play element in culture, he wrote, "All play moves and has its being within a playground marked off beforehand, either materially or ideally, deliberately or as a matter of course. Just as there is no formal difference between play and ritual, so the consecrated spot cannot be formally distinguished from the playground. The arena, the card table, the magic circle, the temple, the stage, the screen, the tennis court, the court of justice are all in form and function playgrounds. Forbidden spots, isolated, hedged round, hallowed, within which special rules obtain. All are temporary worlds within the ordinary world, dedicated to the performance of an act apart." Katie Salin and Eric Zimmerman, in Rules of Play, Game Design Fundamentals, note that even though the magic circle is merely one of the examples in Huizinga's list of playgrounds, the term is used by him as shorthand for the idea of a special place in time and space created by a game. In more detail, they describe, in a very basic sense, the magic circle of a game is where the game takes place. To play a game means entering into a magic circle, or perhaps creating one as a game begins. Thus, somewhat paradoxically, it is the magic circle of games that enables players deeper levels of interaction with the medium. But it is the magic circle's necessity of being that limits the player's interactivity by imposing rules to its fiction. This concept is elucidated in Jesper Juul's Half Real. In this book, Juul asserts that players are real players in false worlds, hence half real. He states that there is a disconnect between the real world and the fiction a game creates. Logically then, the more detailed and thorough the fiction, the more limited the player's interaction becomes. For this reason, I point to adventure games and role-playing games as ones that particularly limit player interactivity in such a way as to reduce them to the forms they are most tied to, literature and film. The amount of player choice is limited to input within the procedural system of game mechanics that govern avatar movement and narrative progress. The amount of player choice given is largely aesthetic, rarely meaningful in and of itself, and mostly arbitrary. Juul makes the point in Half Real that adventure games are particularly vexing to players' meaning-making interactions because of the problematic relationships between game rules and the game world. He states it as an incongruence between rules and fiction. Adventure games are jarring for game players when the rules of the world clash with the fiction of the world. But really, all games contain this clash of rules and fictions. In other words, the possibilities of interactions in the game appear present to the player, but the rules of the game, its ludic system and algorithmic processes, keep the player from engaging fully in the game world. True player choice becomes apparent not through gameplay choices, but by gameplay styles. The distinction is more than semantic. A choice is something programmed into the game. In other words, the game presents players with choices to make. Style, however, is something the player brings to the game. It's only recently that games have become technologically able to adapt and allowed for a wide variety of gameplay styles. Still, it is by altering the style of play, and not the fundamental rules and fictions governing that play, that players make the most meaning from games. The most common way users change games is through a process called modding. But modding is only altering the ludic system of the game, or the aesthetic quality of the game. And while it allows for different player interactions, it is not an altogether different form of interactivity, as it only engages one of the systems of play. As an example, take the mod of Half-Life Counter-Strike. Here, players are actively changing code to a game to create a new one, but they're not making more meaning or engaging in meaning making differently. The move is a lateral one. It is, in a sense, like switching from playing football to baseball. They're still a sport, in a basic sense. A player understands a game more fully and thus makes more meaning when adapting his or her style of play within the game world itself. To use the same analogy as before, is akin to switching positions on the baseball field, as going from pitcher to left fielder. The kind of gameplay deepens meaning because it engenders a different understanding of what it means to play a game, to interact with it. It involves playing the game from a different angle, so to speak. Due to the nature of game design, there are certain boundaries erected, and while many are hidden in plain sight, others are still part of the game itself. By accepting to play, the player subjects him or herself to the rules and structures of the game, and this is what defines the player. A person subjected to a rule-based system, no longer a total free subject. So when players choose to engage the rules of the system, but exploit the rules of the game, they make more meaning, because they're acting in such a way as to engage the game as something more than an ergodic text. An example of this might be a player seeking out glitch spaces in a game for the sheer fun of it, or cheating in a game like The Sims for the sheer joy of having anything you've ever wanted, digitally, as a sim, not in real life. In Understanding Video Games, Jonas Hyde Smith gives an overview of the way game studies has dealt with the player. He outlines 4 main approaches: the susceptible player model, the selective player model, the active player model, and the rational player model. Arseth points out that games sometimes allow their players to do unexpected things, often just because these actions are not explicitly forbidden. In other words, they are not a part of the game's intended repertoire, and would in most cases have been rendered impossible if the game designers could have predicted them. But it is this very unpredictability that enables players to derive rich, varied, and ultimately deeply individual meanings from games. Ewell says that games are playgrounds where players can experiment with doing things they would or would not normally do, echoing Huizinga. And while this is true, it's also still limiting players to playing the game by its own rules. Instead, if playing the game involves the 3 modes of play, sine qua non, players can be their own interpretive community, to borrow the term from literary critic Stanley Fish. When a player acts as his or her own interpretive community, changing styles of play is a way that players break free from the problem of immersive activity constraints placed on them by the way the game rules and game fiction interact. Player interactivity within the game world, within the fiction, but by altered rules, allows players to make meaning by playing any genre of game. This is central to understanding not just the game player and what he does, but why he does it in the first place. Additionally, play in this way presupposes an understanding of the originally designed intent of the game provided by its ludic system and fiction rule interaction. A game like Pip and Bar's Pongs provides an excellent example of this. Pongs is a game comprised of a number of variations on Pong. Bar's recreation of the game engages players in different ways. Many of the playstyles available to players of Pongs engage them in a sort of metagame, where the rule is the same as the original in the sense that points are doled out in the same manner, but the rules are varied in order to interact with the player as a game within or on top of a game. It provides a bit of meta-commentary on how well integrated the original Pong is as a cultural product. Bar's game includes riffs on other classic games like Breakout, as well as gaming tropes like achievement trophies. There are, of course, other games that do this particular kind of gameplay very well.
All of his co-workers were gone. What could it mean? Stanley decided to go to the meeting room. Perhaps he had simply missed a memo. When Stanley came to a set of 2 open doors, he entered the door on his left.
The common thread connecting these types of games is that they're engaging players in meta games, and thus providing space for players to make their own meaning from games. Normally, a player must reinterpret the interplay between rules and fiction in order to arrive at such a level of play. In this way, games are getting closer to pure play, the kind of play experienced with the body, with objects, and socially. The action of the player in the real world upon a controller is a metaphor for action in the game world. Though the programming of the game determines the apparent meaning of that input, the player can change the latent meaning by imbuing meaning into the system itself, because the game leaves that space open, or by imbuing a meaning into the system that was not initially there. At this point in game studies, the field is still young, and many arguments are being made about what a game is and what a game isn't. Attempts to understand games as fiction fall short because games are not necessarily narrative in form or function. Because games are uniquely active, literary, and interactive, a new methodology must be deployed to understand them fully. President of the Digital Game Research Association, Francis Myra, offers a clear path for game studies to take. In his somewhat polemic 3 theses, he says, there needs to be a dedicated academic discipline for the study of games. This new discipline needs to have an active dialogue with and be building on existing ones, as well as having its own core identity. Both the educational and research practices applied in game studies need to remain true to the core playful or ludic qualities of its subject matter. Ian Bogost helpfully points out in comparative video game criticism that scholars of games must be bricoleurs. A bricoleur is a type of handyman, a tinkerer, someone who takes what is already available to him and shapes it into something new. Bogost calls the type of criticism Myra asks for isolationist techno-textual criticism that privileges the ludic over the literary. In favoring the critic as bricoleur, Bogost lays out a vision of game studies that is comparative in nature. Indeed, by acting as a compiler, as a true bricoleur, the critic is working in the same manner as the game designer, using the pieces of what is already understood to create anew. Bogost hopes to answer some of the same questions posed throughout this video. Questions like, what do video games do? What happens when players interact with them? And how do they relate to, participate in, extend, and revise the cultural expression at work in other cultural artifacts. By understanding first what games are, critics may make assertions about what they do, both personally and culturally.